All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And I am so excited for today because today is World Lemur Day. So we have never done a program where we had so many lemur programs in one day ever in our history. It is 5 talks today. We just finished up our one last hour with Mami Radafitsalama live in Madagascar as part of Planet Madagascar's amazing conservation efforts. And now we are diving in with Dr. Keriann McGoogan. So some of us go on little adventures. We go to the store, maybe we go to a local provincial or national park here in Canada, but not Dr. McGoogan. When she was 25, she went to the remote wilds of northwestern Madagascar to try and set up a permanent field site when things started to go a little bit wrong. So today she's going to tell a little bit about her own personal adventures, that story in particular, and her book that she wrote on the topic called Chasing Lemurs. If you didn't see our backdrop image, you'll see it again in a second. Chasing Lemurs is our title we want to highlight today, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to learn about where you can check that out and buy it if you're keen. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Keriann. Looking so very forward to this, and take us away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jesse, and thanks to Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants for having me. And happy World Lemur Day, everybody. So this is an international day where we celebrate lemurs and get to learn a lot about these incredible species. So this slide here shows the cover of my book called Chasing Lemurs, My Journey into the Heart of Madagascar. And as Jesse mentioned, my very first trip to Madagascar was when I was just 25 years old. And that's the story that I tell in this book. So I'm a trained primatologist, which means that I know how to study primates. So primates include monkeys, apes, and of course, lemurs. So I have my PhD in biological anthropology, and that is what brought me to Madagascar in the first place. And as I kind of grew up as a primatologist, I learned a lot about many incredible researchers who came before me. And some of you might recognize this woman on the slide. So I'm pictured on the right. You probably don't recognize me because I'm not that famous. But on the left is Jane Goodall. And so she was incredibly inspirational because I knew that she had traveled to Tanzania to study the chimpanzees when she was 26 years old. And so that was incredibly inspirational for me when I was first learning about primates and primatology. And so that's why I called chapter 1 of Chasing Lemurs, Jane Goodall is Not Alone. But besides being inspired by Jane, I was also inspired by Madagascar itself. In the book, I describe Madagascar as a world unlike any other. So for those of you who don't know a lot about Madagascar, it's an island situated off the southeast coast of Africa. And it's actually the 4th largest island in the whole world. So after New Guinea, Greenland, and Borneo. And it's roughly the size of Alberta. And what makes Madagascar so unique is that it's an island that's been separated from Africa, and it's been separated for millions of years. And so because of that, evolution has really occurred in a microcosm in that country. And so what that leaves us with is some really, really incredible biodiversity. So it has more endemic species than any other country in the whole world. Endemic means that that animal is only found there in Madagascar and it's found nowhere else in the world. So for example, this bird here is a beautiful bird. This is called a crested kua. And my partner Travis always jokes that it reminds him of Lady Gaga because it has this really striking blue eyeshadow like you might see her wearing. So there's other incredible species as well. This is a leaf-tailed gecko. So these guys are really famous for being really adept at camouflage. So this one here is a satanic leaf-tailed gecko. So it specializes in looking just like a dead leaf. So there's lots of dead leaves outside now. So I think this guy's doing a pretty good job of camouflaging himself. There's also chameleons in Madagascar. Half of the world's chameleons live in Madagascar. And that includes the world's largest and the world's smallest chameleon. So the world's smallest chameleon could actually fit on the tip of a matchstick. So it's pretty incredible. It was found kind of by accident in some leaf litter not that long ago. But it's really teeny tiny. This is not him, but this is one of the beautiful chameleons in Madagascar. And then, of course, there's some really bizarre insects that I don't think anyone could have ever imagined exist. This one is one of my favorites. This is a giraffe-necked weevil. It's named a giraffe-necked weevil because it has these really long necks. And I think this kind of looks like almost like an alien species, which a lot of the stuff that you see in Madagascar, because it's so unique and only found there, kind of looks a little bit alien. But it was actually the lemurs that drew me to go to Madagascar. So this is one of them here. And I think this photo says it all. This is maybe the cutest of all the lemurs. This is called a bamboo lemur. And they're specially adapted. They have a very specialized digestive system that allows them to eat bamboo, which has a lot of toxins in it. And so they are adapted to digest those toxins. And of course are very cute as well, as you can see in this photo. But there's actually 107 different species of lemurs that live in Madagascar. And all of those lemurs, 100%, are only found in Madagascar and nowhere else on the planet. So this one here is a ring-tailed lemur. This one might be the most famous of all the lemurs. I think some of you might recognize them. If you're in Ontario or near Toronto, you might have been to the Toronto Zoo, where these ring-tailed lemurs are housed. And I know that Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants will be headed there later today. But you might also recognize this species from the Disney cartoon Madagascar, because this was the iconic King Julian. That singing and dancing lemur was this species of lemur. But what a lot of people don't know is that ring-tailed lemurs are actually female dominant. And so King Julian maybe also actually should have been Queen Juliet. So think about that, ladies. So each of the species of lemurs is unique. This is a nocturnal species called a sportive lemur, and you can tell they're nocturnal by the sheer size of their eyes. They have a reflective layer in their eyes that helps them to see in the dark. And when you shine your light, it looks almost like an orange glow glowing back at you through the trees. And one of my personal favorites is this guy here. This is the Indri, the largest living lemur. And they are famous for the haunting call that they make. So they almost sound like they have a trumpet in their throat. And they use that call for group spacing. So it's kind of their way of saying to the other groups to steer clear. You know, this is where we are. We're eating here. You guys keep away. Many lemurs also have a very special form of locomotion, which is called vertical clinging and leaping. And you can see this lemur is demonstrating that type of locomotion. So they use these powerful hind limbs to spring from one vertical substrate to another, and they can actually clear 10-meter gaps in just one leap. In the book, I joke that they reminded me of a hyped up version of Spider-Man. So I don't know if any of you are dressed as Spider-Man for Halloween this Halloween, but these guys kind of remind me of Spider-Man too. So what drew me in to Madagascar wasn't just how amazing and diverse the lemurs are and how beautiful, as you can see in this photo. In 2006, before I left for that very first trip, I also knew that lemurs are highly endangered. And we now know that they are the most endangered group of animals in the entire world. It's estimated that about 96% of all lemurs are endangered, and a third are actually critically endangered. And that's a lot to do with habitat loss and hunting. So when I get asked sort of what compelled me to go to Madagascar, I tell people that it's because I wanted to go to study lemurs in their natural habitat before it was too late, and I wanted to conduct research that would contribute to their conservation. So back to my trip. So here I am in 2006 when I was 25 years old. I was heading to a place called Kasigi Special Reserve in the remote northwest of Madagascar. And I was a primatologist in training, learning how to be Jane Goodall, basically. So I'd be going there with my PhD supervisor, Dr. Sean Lehman, and we'd be going for 3 months to set up a field site that no one had ever been to before. And that field site was where I planned to return when I went back for my longer PhD research. And I was looking to understand how forest loss impacted the lemur species in Madagascar. So this map is a map of Madagascar, and it shows you where I was going. So Kasigi is circled there in red, and it's extremely remote. It's in the northwest of the country. And to get there, we would have to drive, firstly, to the nearest village, which was called Kandrihu. And that was about 30 kilometers away from Kasigi. So from that village, we had actually have to hike across rocky and sandy terrain, that whole 30 kilometers, which is a really long way to walk, even if you're on a sidewalk. And when we arrived in Kasigi, we would be really, really camping. So we had to bring all of our equipment with us for that full 3 months. We had to hire porters to carry all of our equipment and gear. We would be digging our own toilets. We would be filtering our own water. There was no running water or taps that we could get water from. All of our cooking would be done over an open fire. And because it was so remote, we really just had one chance to make sure that we brought everything that we needed for that 3-month project. So, you know, no pressure at all. So for that trip, obviously we had to do a lot of planning. So my supervisor and I spent many, many months developing a very intricate plan. So this slide just shows one of the many maps of the field site that Sean, my supervisor, and I created in preparation for our journey. So we spent a lot of time mapping out the site. We had secured our permits, we had all of our gear, and we were as ready as we ever could have been. Neither of us took this expedition lightly, but one important lesson that I learned on that trip is that there's sometimes a big difference between a plan and reality. Some of the best advice that I got from one of my supervisors as a graduate student was that no proposal survives the field. Something inevitably will not go as planned. You have to be able to adapt and revise. So that's a very important lesson that I take with me always in my life. But thinking back on this trip, I would say that adapting and revising was an understatement. In the introduction of the book, I write, despite careful planning and preparation, the trip spiraled out of control. Food poisoning, impassable backcountry roads, grueling hikes, challenging local politics, malaria, these would turn a simple reconnaissance outing into an epic field test. So why would we put ourselves through that? Well, I have to come back again to the lemurs. I was there to study the lemurs in their natural habitat, and Kasiigi had 8 different species that we might be able to see. This one here on the slide is the one that I was interested in studying for the long term. So I wouldn't be going it alone on my journey. I would be surrounded by a pretty large team of people. So this image shows the team. It shouldn't take you too long to find me there standing at the back. I was the only woman on the trip. My supervisor, Sean, was taking the photo, and along with 2 field students, Andrea and Sahubi, they were university students from the University of Antananarivo. We would be heading out there to Kasiigi. We hired a cook named Fidel when we reached the nearest large town, and we also hired 2 guides named Noel and Jesua. We were also told to bring members of the gendarme, which is the military from Madagascar, because the officials were concerned about how remote Kasiigi was. So they wanted us to make sure that we were safe. And so they required that we take these armed military men with us. And then the rest of the people in this photo are people who helped us to cut our trails through the forest because we needed to clear paths to be able to find the lemurs in the forest. So they would only be there for the first part of the trip. So my first stop on my journey was a place called Antananarivo. So I always challenge people to say that 3 times fast, but that's the capital city of Madagascar. And I'll give you a shortcut. You can call it Tana for short. I had actually flown there from Toronto, and I would meet up with my supervisor in that capital city of Madagascar. And we would spend a few days in Tana gathering various supplies, mostly food. So we went to this place here, which is the Anakeli market, to stock up on mostly rice and beans, because I learned very quickly that people in Madagascar love eating rice, and it's extremely culturally significant there. And they ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's what we would do for the rest of the field trip. We would be eating rice for every single meal. In Tana, we faced the first major roadblock of our journey. Both Sean and I got a pretty bad case of food poisoning, and we had to go on a course of antibiotics. So it actually took us 5 days to recover because we were both so sick. So we left Tana about a week later than what we had hoped to. But we tried to still shake it off. You know, it wasn't so bad. We both recovered, and we prepared ourselves for our trip. So we packed our bags. This shows some of my bags and boxes, and you'll see some of the stuff is actually packed in these sacks, which are rice sacks. because it was a bit easier for the porters to be able to kind of strap those onto a stick and carry them along on the hike. And we eventually did leave Tana. We squeezed into these 2 4x4s and we set out on the road. It was about a 6-hour drive along this paved highway. You can see me there standing at the side of the road. And the officials assured us that even though that road was unpaved, even after this, we'd actually hit an unpaved road for the rest of the way, I should say. And the officials told us that even though that road was unpaved, it would actually be decent because it was the dry season. So we weren't anticipating any major stumbling blocks on the drive. But this is what the road looks like. So once that paved road ended, we ended up on this really, really muddy route, I guess. In the book, I write that we quickly discovered that the decent roads were sandy, wet, and filled with unexpected patches of mud. And because we were now carrying so much weight with all of our equipment, we kept getting stuck. So this image shows just one of the many times that we actually had to pile out of the vehicles, strap it to a rope, try to pull it out with one of the other vehicles. It was pretty insane how many times we had to get in and out of that truck. But that wasn't even the worst part, because after we got out of that muddy section, we then found ourselves here along this section where there were all these rocky boulders of sandstone. In the book, I write that the drivers faced a dilemma each time we came across a rocky area, because they would have to get out, take a look around the vehicle, make sure that there wasn't any huge holes or gaps that the vehicle could fall in, and then we would all pile back in and slowly make our way down these rocky boulders. So that drive along that unpaved part of the road, we had thought would take us a couple of hours, actually took us 6 full hours of driving. But we did make it to Kendrihu. So this is an image in Kendrihu. And in Kendrihu, we faced another challenge on our journey because we had a lot of trouble finding enough people to carry our vast amounts of equipment, that 30 kilometers. And in retrospect, that's not a huge surprise because it was hot, the hike was very long, and they would be carrying a lot of equipment and supplies. So we ended up hiring a few men to carry our gear as porters, and then a few of these, what you see in this photo, which is a zebu cart. So zebu are like a Madagascar cow. So they're kind of like a cross between a cow and a camel because they have these huge fatty lumps on their backs. And so they would carry the equipment in the carts. In Kendrihu, so we'd had everything organized, but then we found ourselves delayed once more because Sahubi, who you see in this slide, revealed that he actually had a terrible throat infection and he had been kind of fighting it off since we left. So he ended up having to visit a doctor in Kendrihu, which also delayed us another few days while we stayed there while he recovered. So the problem with all of these delays is that for every day that we were delayed, that meant that there was one less day that my supervisor, Sean, would be spending with me in the field. And that matters because this was the first time I'd ever been to Madagascar, and I was really relying on Sean because he had been there before and he was going to help me get things set up before he had to leave. He was only going to be staying for a month. And so we really felt like we were running up against the clock at this point. But we did finally set out on that 30-kilometer hike from Kendrihu to Kasiji. And we were trying to stay all together with all the people in the carts together so that we could stop, make food, and camp. And we were hoping that the hike would take, just a couple of days. We were hiking along this river here, which you see in the slide. It's called the Mahavavi River. And so that meant we were hiking a lot on sand. And then periodically we would have to do what you see in this photo, which is crossing those bends in the river. So that hike took us a lot longer than we thought, as is the theme of this trip. So it turns out that zebu carts are very slow because they had to stop. The cattle had to drink and graze. And there are a few nights where the carts actually were late meeting us, and one night where they didn't make it to our meeting point at all. And unfortunately, that night they had our tents on them. And so we ended up sleeping on the floor of one of these Malagasy homes in a small village. The other issue was that the carts could only take us so far. At a certain point, actually at this village that you see in this slide, they would not be able to continue because there was no more road for them to travel along. And so in this village, we had to look for more people to help us carry our other supplies. And that was very difficult because these are very small villages. And so we spent a lot of time waiting and hoping that we could find enough people to carry all of our equipment. So that brings me to another part of my journey, because at this point, I had never seen a lemur in the wild. And so I was getting very desperate to see one. I really wanted to see one. And there had been so many unexpected delays so far that I was worried that I never would see a lemur in the wild at this point. So I was very surprised and excited when I did finally see a lemur. And that was actually in one of those small villages called Bamuntu. And I was a little surprised that I would see that lemur in that village, because when I pictured myself seeing my first lemur, I had pictured myself in a big tall forest and the lemur way up high in the tall tree. But what I actually saw was this small little mouse lemur in a scrubby bush near a village. And the reason why these mouse lemurs can live there is that they're actually very tolerant of living in smaller trees. They have a varied diet, and they are small in size as well. They're also nocturnal, and so my first lemur sighting was in the dark. We had spotted them because we shined our light and we saw those characteristic orange orbs shining back at us. And I mean, I'm not sad that this was my first lemur. I mean, look at this guy. He's the smallest of all the lemurs. It could fit in the palm of your hand. It could fit in a teacup. In the book, I write that they remind me of Stuart Little because they look like a mouse, but they have the intelligence of a primate. So seeing this lemur at this point in the trip was very important because it reminded me of why I was there, and it helped me to keep going. So we did eventually make it to Kasiji. We were able to hire boats to help take the rest of our supplies from the village where I saw the lemur. And we hiked here to what I hoped would be our last camp, which was just 5 kilometers away. But at this point from Tana, it had taken us 12 days and basically every ounce of strength, patience, and determination that I could muster. But I knew that just over that rise, the lemurs awaited. So we got there, we managed to set up our camp. Sean stayed for a few days to help get us all going on finding the lemurs along the trails. But eventually he would have to leave, and he would bring out with him most of the team. And that would leave me there with just the 2 guides, and Andri Sahubi, who had the one with the throat infection, had to leave unexpectedly because of a family emergency. So it was me and Andrea were the only 2 there who spoke English. And at first it was glorious. There were lemurs right at camp. We discovered a lemon grove in the middle of the forest, and the camp was next to that beautiful river. This image just shows, like, just above my tent, you can kind of see there's a small little lemur there, but this was right at camp. So it was pretty incredible. But what I didn't know at the time was that my trip was only really just beginning at this point. Because one night, just a few days after Sean had left, my cook Fidel woke me up, and he took me over to Andrew's tent, where I found that he was terribly sick, and he managed to tell me that I think it might be malaria, is what he said. And so I was in the remote wilds of Kasiji. It had taken me 12 days to hike in. We had finally set up our camp and seen lemurs in the wild. And after I heard Andrew say, I think it might be malaria, I knew that I was about to face the most difficult situation of my life in getting him out and back to safety. And so that's the story that I tell in Chasing Lemurs. So I'll leave it there and answer some questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Keriann. Again, we have Chasing Lemurs as a backdrop. If you want to come out of screen share so you can see us a little better, have a bit of a conversation, that would be great. We've got our 4 classes. We've got 3 more full classes joining on YouTube, and kids in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ontario, Virginia, Nova Scotia, and beyond. So thank you so much to all our amazing groups for joining in today. If you're on YouTube, share questions in the chat bar. I'd love to see as many as we can over the next 20 minutes or so. But we're going to start by going to Highland Park, Halifax. So we're going to go to Miss Bradbury's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question, just demute your mic and you'll be good to go. In fact, all our teachers can demute their microphones over the next minute or so. So Miss Bradbury, come on up and share a question with us.
Oh my God, I can see us. Hi, that was awesome. We really enjoyed it. I don't know if any of our kids have got questions. They're very excited about seeing you guys. Does anyone have a question they want to ask about the lemurs? No. Maybe come back to us and we may.
Guys, no worries. All right, let's go to Miss Lavin's class in Kitchener. If you guys have a question for us, come on up.
Does anybody have a question?
No, but we're excited to say hi. Well, let's see if we have any questions online. So Jess in Mount Orab, Wisconsin, one of our most enthusiastic kids over the last few months. How many species of lemur are there, Keriann?
There are 107 different species of lemur, and they're only found in Madagascar, nowhere else on the planet.
Yeah. How many have you seen? You highlighted a few of the cool species that you got a chance to check out.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of lemur researchers try to keep a checklist of how many different lemurs they've seen. I didn't do that, but I at least there's 8 different species at the site where I ended up going to do my work. So I would guess I've seen about 20 different species of lemur. So I've only really just scratched the surface.
Hey, 20 is pretty amazing. Way more than most people will ever get a chance to. All right, Miss Fleenor's class. I know you guys have a question in Richmond, Virginia. So come on up, just demute your microphone, and you're good to go. Take your time. There you go.
Hi.
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 What is the biggest lemur you ever seen?
What is the biggest lemur I've ever seen? So the biggest lemur is the one that I showed you in my slideshow, which is the Indri. That's the largest living lemur that exists. There used to be, though, extinct lemurs that were the size of gorillas. So unfortunately, those species have gone extinct, but I did get the chance to see an Indri, which reminded me almost like a kid wearing a panda costume on Halloween. So big.
I'm trying to get the name really quick for the super lemur. I think it's Megalodapus, and I think I might have the spelling right for that. But do check that out when you're done. Some really, really cool extinct animals on Madagascar, including the biggest bird egg and one of the biggest birds to ever exist as well. So some really, really cool stuff. All right, I'm going to come to Miss Byrne's class in just a second. Miss Lavin's class, you guys have a question now, so come on in. Share with us.
Why are lemurs called lemurs?
So lemurs, why are lemurs called lemurs? So the word lemur actually was given to the lemurs from Portuguese explorers who landed in Madagascar. And it means the spirits of the dead. Because when they landed in Madagascar, they heard these haunting calls that nobody knew what they were. And it turned out to be the lemurs. And they thought it reminded them of kind of like a ghost or a spirit.
That is a question that I wasn't expecting to get, and it's not one that I would have expected you to have such a ready answer for, but that is the coolest answer of all time. That's amazing, Keriann. Cool question, guys. All right, let's go back to Virginia, Miss Byrne's class in Mechanicsville. If you guys have a question for us.
What is malaria?
What is malaria? I figured someone would be asking that. So malaria is a parasite. And it's like a disease transmitted by mosquitoes in certain countries. And so the reason why my field assistant got malaria is because he had been bitten by a mosquito and he didn't have proper medication to prevent malaria, which there is. And so he got sick and basically it causes a fever and the chills. And luckily he was able to get help and get better.
Fantastic. Sorry, just a quick note for our teachers. You don't need to raise your hands. I will come back to everyone, I promise. So you can put your hand down. I will see you in a minute, Miss Laffin. A great follow-up to this, and without spoiling the whole book, Keriann, Tavin, joining us in Raleigh, North Carolina, wants to know, what were you thinking when you said it might be malaria? What was going through your head at that moment?
Oh, yes, Tavin, I was very, very concerned at that point because it was the middle of the night. I'd been woken up by my cook, and that's not sort of something you would do. We didn't know each other that well. We'd only kind of just met recently. So when he woke me up in the middle of the night, I knew something was really wrong. And when I went over to Andrew's tent and he said that, I felt very scared at first because I knew that I needed to get help for him, and I needed to bring him to a doctor because I'm not a doctor. And I knew that malaria could be very bad if he didn't get treatment. So I was worried and I was scared, and I was running scenarios about how I was going to get us out of there. So that was what was going through my head.
Great question, guys. And again, I want to note, I'm going to say this at the end as well. If you want to check out more about the book, if you want to read the story, we've got a few people on YouTube that are keen to do so. Keriann's got a website. You can find out more about the book, how you can buy it, all on the site. Check her out on social media as well at Keriann McGoogan. All right, let's take a few quick YouTube questions. Miss Lee's class joining us in Ottawa. They have so many great questions in the YouTube chat bar here. So some simple ones. Naya wants to know, what's the lifespan of a lemur?
So it depends on the lemur. So there's 107 different species, and some are very small, like that mouse lemur. So they're a little bit shorter lived, and some are bigger. So I would say it's roughly between 10 to 14 years is how long they would live.
Awesome. And then a really quick, easy follow-up from the same teacher. Sebastian wants to know, how intelligent are lemurs?
So lemurs are primates, and so because of that, primates are one of the more intelligent species. We have big brains relative to our body sizes. And lemurs are pretty smart, I would say. They are well adapted to live in their environments. They would actually, the species that I studied would actually learn different routes through the forest. So they would jump from tree to tree, and they knew exactly where they were heading. So they had these kind of mental maps that would get them from place A to place B. So they were pretty smart.
If you ever get a chance, or when we're done this broadcast, go check out Shafaka jumping between trees. It's one of the coolest, fastest things in nature, and it's really, really fantastic. Right up there with gibbons swinging. So primates have some really cool ways of getting around. All right, Miss Jenny's class joining us on YouTube. They wanted to ask, are there laws or regulations in Madagascar to help protect the lemurs?
Yeah, so there is an agency that I worked with pretty closely when I was there doing my research called Madagascar National Parks. And part of their job is to protect the forest and to protect the wildlife and species that live there. So the government is working to make a difference there. But it depends where you are. In certain communities, once you get really remote, you don't see as much participation from the government in those areas. So that's where things get a little bit more difficult. But there are also local cultural, things that help protect lemurs and help prevent hunting as well.
Yeah, it's a very thoughtful question, guys, and thanks, Keriann, for a really nice answer. It's something that we're going to be getting all day long. Again, World Lemur Day, 5 programs, so highlighting conservation issues, what's happening in Madagascar, how people can take part. So I really like when we get a chance to share those questions. All right, Highland Park Schools and Miss Bradbury's class, if you want to ask a question, you can type in the chat bar that you have a question, and then I'll come to you live. But I am going to go to Miss Laffins right now. If you have one, come on up.
How many lemurs did you see?
Ooh, how many lemurs did you see?
How many lemurs did I see? So a lot. So there was 8 different species that lived at the site where I ended up going back from my long PhD research. So I saw, there's I think 4 types of lemurs that were active in the day and 4 that were active at night. And then I saw the injury. I saw the shafakas. So I saw a lot of different species of lemurs when I was there.
Awesome. Thanks, Miss Laffin student. All right, let's go to Halifax. Miss Bradbury's class, just demute your mic. You're good to go.
Were the lemurs super hairy?
Are the lemurs super hairy? So so lemurs have a lot of fur. And one thing that really struck me, so they're covered head to toe in fur. And the species that I studied, which was the cockerel shafaka, are almost pure. They have this pure white fur with a little bit of maroon colorations. And so I was always impressed at how clean they kept their fur because, it was pretty dirty where they lived. They lived in the forest. They were jumping in the trees, on the ground, but they still kept their fur like snowy white. And that's because they groom each other a lot. So they have a special type of tooth in their mouth called a tooth comb. And they actually use that tooth to groom each other, and they spend hours and hours and hours every single day doing that.
I really encourage all our classes to look up tooth comb when you're done, because it's a really, really cool thing that, you know, you can't even envision as a person. It would be so weird to have something like that. So yeah, great question, guys. All right, Madeline on YouTube has a question, then we're going to go to Miss Byrne and Miss Fleenor's to wrap up. Madeline's question is, she's seen a lot of people touching and handling lemurs in pictures before, and she wants to know, can lemurs be domesticated, and does having one affect the lemur in any way? I'm really glad we got this question.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there's many different threats to lemurs, and one of them is the pet trade. And unfortunately, a lot of people, because lemurs are so cute and they're so soft and furry, a lot of people think they would be good pets, but like all primates, primates are very social, very intelligent, but they don't make good pets because they're also wild animals. And so it's not good for the lemurs, and it's not good for the people to have lemurs as pets.
Yeah, it's something that we covered in our last broadcast too, and in basically every session that we cover on wild animals. If you see pictures of people holding animals, having animals on their head, stroking them with someone in the wild, it's basically universally a bad thing. National Geographic has actually had a whole series in the last year highlighting the fact that most animal interactions that you can have in the wild are not sustainable. They're not good for animals. There are very rare exceptions to this, but be very wary when you travel either locally or internationally about those sort of experiences. And certainly lemur and wildlife trafficking and trade in general is a big threat to a lot of endangered species. So there's a lot of resources out there for all grade levels where you can learn more about that. But I'm really glad we got that question. So thanks, Madeline. All right, Miss Byrne's class, come on back in and share with us.
How much do lemurs weigh?
Oh, so that's another great question. So again, because there are 107 different species, it really varies. So the species that I studied, which is the Shifaka, they weighed 8 kilograms. So they're pretty medium sized. But then they go down to as small as the mouse lemurs, which can be about 500 grams. So they're tiny, they could fit in a teacup. And then you have the big Indri, who's about closer to 12 to 14 kilograms. So it really depends.
Yeah, awesome, guys. All right, Miss Fleenor's class, come on back in, deem your mic, and we'll take a few questions from YouTube at the end as we're whipping through these. This is great.
How many lemurs are there alive right now?
Yeah, so there are, in terms of species, there's 107 different species of lemurs. And then the size of their population varies. Some are doing pretty well and have a lot of different individuals that live in their populations, but others are more threatened with extinction.
Yeah, we talked about mouse lemurs earlier, and that's a fairly common species. Some of the more charismatic and recognizable ones, like Kokoril shifaka, so Zabumafu to a lot of you, and the lemur on the image in the book behind Keriann there, are very, very endangered. There's fairly limited populations. Lemurs, again, are the most threatened group of animals in the world. So there's a lot of conservation challenges with them, but a lot of ways that you guys can take action, and we will cover that before the end of the broadcast today. So Ms. Jennings' class wanted to know, how long were you there researching after all the delays? You do this journey, everything's taking longer than expected. How long are you actually there before things work out?
Well, that's a great question. So the trip was supposed to be 3 months. That emergency happened about a month into the trip. So we ended up having to evacuate, and my trip was unfortunately cut short. So I ended up flying home a bit earlier than what I had thought. So that first trip was about a month and a bit. But then I did go back, spoiler, I did go back to Madagascar, where I lived there for 14 months. So I had a very successful, longer field research season for 14 months, where I spent that time living in a tent and chasing lemurs through the forest.
And I was going to say, are you in the 5-star Hilton during this experience? So you're in a tent, you're in a remote section of rainforest. How are you getting food? How are you getting water? Like, what's this experience like?
So yeah, so when we were going to Kasiji, that was an extremely remote field site. So we had to bring all of our food and water filtration systems with us when we were going there. But the site that I went back to for that 14 months had a little bit more infrastructure. So there was running water, there were toilets, and we could actually drive there off of the highway. So it got a lot easier after that first trip.
Lesson learned. But yes, do check out the book. Again, Keriann's website. You can find out how you can learn more about the full story if you guys get a chance at the end of the broadcast. I encourage you to do that and check out the site. I want to take one more question from YouTube before wrapping up. Amazingly, we're at the 40-minute mark already, Keriann. Time flies when you're having fun. So Elliot and Miss Lee's class want to know, is there a punishment for people who hunt lemurs? What's the situation with hunting lemurs in the country?
Yeah, so there are laws against illegal poaching and illegal hunting there, and yeah, so there would be some form of punishment, fines and possibly jail time for people who illegally hunt.
Yeah, it's something where, again, we had covered this in our last broadcast too, between 9 and 10, and it was the idea that most people that are doing things like clearing forest, hunting animals, are doing it for subsistence. They're doing it to make a livelihood because that's one of the only ways you can make a livelihood in certain communities in Madagascar. So it's not there. I want to stress that the conservation challenges here are not the result necessarily of evil people doing bad things. It's people that are struggling to make a living, and there's limited options available to them. So this is something where local conservation groups that make it a vested interest of protecting the habitats and the species there go a really long way to ensuring the conservation successes in these countries. So I'm glad we got that question. And speaking of conservation successes, Keriann, again, we've highlighted your book, we've highlighted your story. Hopefully kids are inspired to learn more. What can they do to take action to help save lemurs? Again, World Lemur Day. What can we do to protect these species?
Yeah, so I think about that a lot because I spend a lot of my time thinking about lemurs and about the threats to lemurs. And I'm glad you brought up, Jesse, that it's not just a black and white issue because, you know, the people in Madagascar are also some of the poorest people in the world, and they're cutting down forests and they're hunting lemurs, but they're doing it to feed their families. So it's a complicated issue. And so for me, I volunteer my time for an organization called Planet Madagascar, who I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot today with World Lemur Day. But there's other things that you can do. So the first thing you can do is to educate yourself about lemurs and about Madagascar and to learn more because, you know, once you know about something, that really can inspire you to find ways to help and to find things that you can do. So learn about them, tell other people about lemurs and about why they're endangered and what the threats are, and spread that message. That's a big part of why World Lemur Day exists, is because it starts this dialogue where we can all learn a little bit more about maybe something that we didn't know. So that's one way. You know, I would say, you know, reach out to organizations like Planet Madagascar or other organizations. There's the Lemur Conservation Network if you want to learn more about different conservation organizations who are working actively to help lemurs and to help people in Madagascar.
Fantastic. And then, Keriann, you didn't mention this because I know you're involved with the organization, but I want to stress that donations is a great way that you can help take part. One of the things we like to do at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants is connect kids that are really keen to make a difference with organizations that are doing amazing work. And in Madagascar, because it's one of the poorest countries in the world, money there goes a lot further to helping further conservation initiatives. In countries where people make on the order of $1,000 or $2,000 Canadian a year, that money can go towards protecting forests, saving habitat, saving species, and building up local communities in a really, really impactful way. So if you're ever keen, Planet Madagascar is a fantastic organization. Again, Keriann mentioned the charity network of all the groups helping to protect lemurs and Malagasy habitats. So hope you guys get a chance to check that out too. Keriann, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so nice to finally have you on the broadcast. This is great.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for hosting.
My pleasure, and great groups, over 150 kids tuning in from across Ontario, Virginia, Nova Scotia, and beyond. So thank you to all our classes for tuning in. What we do at the end of every broadcast, I'm going to bring back in all our live groups to say a big thank you and goodbye. So Miss Bradbury, Miss Lavin, Miss Byrne, and Miss Fleenor, if you want to demute your microphones and get ready to come on in, you can all say thank you and goodbye. Thanks, guys. Bye.